Hello, friends. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I am so excited because I have one of my absolute favorite booktubers here with me, Lady Jane Books. We are back. The tag team is reunited, so I couldn't be more happy about that. And today, we're going to talk about the Icepick Surgeon, and this subtitle is pretty long, so I'm going to have to read it. Murder, fraud, sabotage, piracy, and other dastardly deeds perpetrated in the name of science by Sam King. So, Lady Jane and I read this, I guess, starting in the middle of January into February, and we had such a great time reading this together, such a great time talking about it. But I guess I'll start out, Jane, just asking you what your overall impressions were of the book.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me on your channel. I am always excited when I get to hang out with very literary Carrie. So thank you so much for having me here and hosting this live show. So this one has been on my radar because my dad actually bought me a copy for my birthday because he knows that I like weird science things and like murder and all these weird and wonderful things. So he was like, this looks great for you. And I really enjoyed the science aspect and the perspective on ethics throughout this book. I thought that was really interesting. I really liked how it was written. It was written in a very interesting way that we'll get into a little bit more. But overall, I really enjoyed it. It was shocking in some points, but it was really, really an interesting read. What did you think about it, Carrie? I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, before I get into my thoughts, I do want to address Ryan's question. So Ryan just
Hi, Ryan.
asked if he should read, if he should watch this if he hasn't yet read the book. And I would say he's
Good
okay to
question.
watch this, wouldn't you say,
Yeah,
Jane? I
we're
mean,
not
we're
going
not
to
good.
talk about any
Yeah,
spoilers or anything like that. I
we
mean,
we're going to talk about our thoughts, and we're probably going to talk about some of the little stories and vignettes that are covered in the book, but there's no way we could cover everything
no,
that's in this book. So
no.
I think you're perfectly fine, Ryan, and hopefully you do read it and you enjoy it as much as we
Yeah.
did.
Yeah, reading this book is definitely an experience. So even if you did, watch it fully, reading it on your own is going to give you so much more information than Carrie and I can. So I think you're good, Ryan, too. And thank you for joining in.
Yeah, and actually, one of the things that I liked about the book, and I think if any of you start reading the book, you'll see this. He does reference in his notes section particular podcast episodes that
Mm,
he has done, and some are on the topics in the book, and some are kind of going beyond the topics that he discusses in the book. So I think that part of the book was really kind of almost interactive. So I think you could get as much out of this book as you want to. If you really want to follow up and go, listen to those podcasts, I think that could probably enhance your experience. And I haven't done that yet, but I
right.
actually might do that because I did enjoy this book so much. To me, this book was kind of true crime, a little bit of true crime, a little bit of medical history, and I really
Hmm.
enjoyed that. There were a lot of little historical oddities, which I'm all about.
Yep.
And there were a few things that I'd heard of or was familiar with, and there were lots of things that I wasn't familiar with. So I liked having that mixture in there as well. And I will say, I think we would both agree that the writing style was very easy to read.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Um, yeah, I really enjoyed how it was written because even though a lot of the content was very graphic and at times gross, it didn't really gross me out. And I'm really not one to get squeamish about much just because if you study history, you can't really afford to get too
Mm.
squeamish over things. But I feel like his writing style really did a lot to offset any of those feelings.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And part of the writing style that I really enjoyed is that it felt very conversational, like you were sitting in almost like on a lecture or something like that, or you were listening to somebody speak to you about what we were talking about. And I also absolutely love his humor. And it just comes up and it
Yeah.
comes up in the most random ways and in the most surprising. Like he does a really great job breaking up really serious topics and then be like, well, you thought your job was bad to check out that guy. So just really, really funny things that caught me off guard. I think it really helped because sometimes the tone got really heavy in some of these things because it is about like medical ethics and it is about like what was happening to human beings. So sprinkling in like the little tiny bits of humor at really random times, I thought was very, very entertaining, and I really liked it.
Yeah, and I remember you made the comment that it really kind of read like a collection of essays.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did. But essays with like humor too.
Yeah.
So you got the knowledge part, but you also were entertained enough to keep reading.
Yeah, very fast paced, and I do see the influence of him being a podcaster because I think a lot of that humor and that kind of infotainment kind of thing comes from being a podcaster. So I'm very interested to actually listen to one of his podcasts
Yes.
just to see how good he is, and this really makes me want to read more of his work. So
Yeah, I hadn't
maybe
heard of him before this. Yeah, who knows? Maybe we're not going to say it, but we're going to say it. I actually had not heard of Sam Keane before this book. And I think he has another really interesting one. I forget. You had mentioned it to me. Was it like the
the
disappearing spoon?
disappearing spoon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting. So there are more works out there that potentially we could read at some point.
You
So
know.
you never know. You never know with Jane and Carrie. You just never know
Never
on this
know.
channel.
So, the introduction to this book, or the prologue, starts out with a lot of salacious stories dealing with Cleopatra and her interest in science, particularly her interest in discovering when fetuses become male or female. And the book really goes into a lot of detail about some of the really experiments she conducted, really brutal experiments that she conducts um, in order to find this information out. So, and for me and you, I think that was pretty shocking right out of the gate.
Yeah.
So, how much do you think this author relied on the shock factor to draw the reader into this book?
Oh, so much. Like that was only like the tip of the iceberg with a lot of these stories. And I remember I actually we the first day we were reading it, I texted you and I said, "Hey, if this is like too much, like we don't have to like do this cuz even like I feel like I can handle a lot of things. I do like horror, I do like, scary stuff and things like that. But it was so graphic that I was like, I don't know if we should do this. But I think what he was trying to do, he wasn't trying to shy away from how brutal a lot of these items were. And I think he was trying to kind of get it off the bat so it didn't like sneak up on you later, like you kind of knew what you were getting into. And I think that's why he opened up with the story because it was an incredibly graphic, very sad, very scary thing to read. So in that case, I feel like it was almost like a test, like if you can get past this, the rest of it's fine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Kind of setting the tone for everything, but he didn't want to like sneak up on you later and then have you maybe not finish the book. So I personally think it was really valuable because you knew what you were getting into first thing, rather than being sneaky about it or being like underhanded, later. What did you think, Carrie?
Right. Well, hey, Margaret, happy Sunday.
Hey, how are you?
So I feel like to a certain extent, but in a milder form, teachers do the same thing. Actually, I teach a class called Teachers for Tomorrow, and in that class, we're reading a professional development book that talks about different hooks and different things that teachers use to garner attention. And one of the hooks that we talk about is the taboo hook, which is very effective at the high school level. It's one of those things that I used a lot when I taught history. You tell them something taboo about an era or, a group of people, and then you have their attention. So then you can actually teach them something,
That's cool.
Students, even myself, I think even you, Jane, like we're kind of into that taboo, that stuff that's a little bit gross, a little
shocking,
shocking. It's really
scandalous.
scandalous. It's hard to wrap your head around like how someone could do those things. So I think that Keene is really superb at this. Obviously, he's taken it to a different level. Like, obviously, this sort of thing would be, appropriate in the high school classroom, but I didn't like how he waited until the end of that introduction to admit to us that the stories about Cleopatra
Yes.
really could have been manufactured by her enemies. And,
Yes.
that made me question the academic veracity of this book right off the bat, which I don't like. But I can see why he did that. I know why he did that, because he wanted to get us hooked first. Like, I
Right.
understand his thinking behind that. And once I started reading the book, I mean, I do feel like it was well researched.
Yeah.
Did you feel the same way, Jane? Did
Yeah,
you feel like the research was
I was actually going to bring that up too, that I was like, the one thing about that section was that after like he like almost presented this as fact, then he was like, well, it's not really fact, it could be made up. And I'm like, come on now. Like, that would not have scored me points on one of my papers if I did that.
right?
So I was a little bit concerned about that too. And that's why I also said to you, I was like, I don't know how factual this is. I don't know, like
Yeah,
going forward. But I do think part of this book is entertainment as well. And yes, saying that story was actually entertaining, as horrifying as it is to say about Cleopatra. But I agree that he was using the hook and he was trying
yeah,
to like say, okay, well, let's see what else I got in store. Um, but yes, I do think it was well researched. He had citations absolutely everywhere. So I see why he did it. I feel like that was a little bit of a dirty trick right at the beginning.
yeah,
And I think it's actually kind of a dangerous thing to do, because I think
yeah.
you and I even were saying like, I don't know. I don't know how well this is going to go, but we stuck with it.
Right.
But unless you stuck with it, you may have dropped it for that reason, because I was very nervous that I was like, well, is this going to be like just a shock factor book? Is this actually going to be entertaining, or is it going to be informative at all? Or is it just recounting these really, really gross stories that may or may not be true? So thankfully, I think it worked out, but I was a little bit nervous at that very first introduction.
Yeah, for sure. In his defense, though, I will say that Cleopatra is one of the most enigmatic historical
Yeah.
figures. And, scholars and historians don't even agree, like, how she actually committed suicide, if she,
Mm,
if the story about her letting the venomous snake bite her, if that was actually true, or if she ingested poison. I think there's still a lot of kind of
yeah.
speculation around her.
Yeah.
So, I'll give him a pass for that, I guess.
If he did it again, though, then I would have been
He
mad.
did
But
it
the first
again.
time, you
Yeah.
can get away with it once in your introduction and then never again.
Never again. Um, so what were your favorite sections of the book?
So there was two that I really enjoyed. The first one was the body snatching. There's an one about I think it was Victorian England, if I'm right. I can't
Mhm.
recall because we
Yeah.
read this a while ago. But it was about Victorian England and about medical students back in Victorian England didn't have access to cadavers, and at a time where anatomy was really up and coming and science was really taking off, and they were searching for knowledge of how the body worked. A lot of the students couldn't do that because there weren't cadavers, there weren't dead people. And so this caused a whole underground operation of people body snatching from graves and like newly dead people. And then, of course, as is human nature, you find something that's profitable, you're going to go and make a black market for it. And it talks about, murders that was occurring in order to meet this demand in the market. I thought from an economical standpoint, that was really interesting on how they made this whole market and there was such a demand for it, but also from like an ethical and just a creep factor one too. I thought it
Yeah.
was really, really interesting. I loved hearing, I think it was Burke and Hare, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Hmm.
Burke and
Yeah.
Hare. I loved hearing about their stories. It was so creepy. It was like the quintessential creepy Victorian story that I just love and just worms its way into my heart. So that one I think was my favorite section of all time. The
Yeah.
sec the second one was definitely the one about lobotomies.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Carrie?
So the body snatcher section was great, because I do think that kind of really illustrated that time period well. Like, I really
Mm.
had this image of, medical students clamoring for these bodies at executions, they're
Yeah,
really,
that was
kind of
scared me
like
so bad.
clamoring
I was
over
like,
them.
oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And because of stuff we've read previously, the Dr. Cream book, for example,
Dr.
he
Cream.
he was a doctor. He was in the medical community of that time, and just looking at that era and that um, whole scene, you can kind of see how some very depraved individuals would be attracted to medicine at that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So it kind of explains a little bit maybe about like Dr. Cream and people like him who, of course, we look at the medical community as people who are dedicated to helping you. And yes, they may have to do some gory things to make that happen and to gain knowledge, but
Mhm.
their ultimate goal is for good. But looking at this time period in particular and the body snatching and all of that, you can definitely see how it may attract some people with some nefarious sort of ideas, for
Absolutely.
sure, for sure. So I like that one as well. But and not it also I liked the psychological experiments that they talked about
Mm.
with the CIA at Harvard,
Yes.
which I did know about that one because I've had an interest in Ted Kaczynski and the Unabomber case, which is the longest and most expensive FBI case in history. And I think that obviously there were things that were not right with Ted Kaczynski from the beginning. I think there were some signs that things were not right, but
Yeah.
I think that you can't deny that being a part of this psychological experiment when he was 16 when he entered Harvard, so a very formative age, definitely broke something in him. I mean, the whole purpose of that psychological
Yeah.
experiment was to break down enemy agents so they would be not usable um, against the U.S. government. So, yeah, that one really interested me. There were so many interesting stories with the lobotomies. I thought it was an interesting connection there as well that the CIA didn't experiment in lobotomies or anything, but that they had even thought that maybe a lobotomy could cure communism.
Yeah.
Like if
I read
someone
that
was
too, and I was like,
communist, I was like, okay.
hmm.
Yeah, the lobotomy stuff was pretty intense. That was pretty intense.
That was intense, but it was very interesting to see. Like, I do think with the way it's presented, they felt like they were actually helping people, but
Yeah,
knowing now what we know, it's probably one of the worst things you could have probably done to somebody. But
yeah,
it's showing how like science changed and its ethics. You know what I mean? At the time, it
yeah,
was like the heyday thing to do. You know what I mean? You have a cold, get a lobotomy. That's how it was. They generally thought that they were trying to help people from all these ailments, and it's actually quite sad to see that they relied on it so heavily. But we have that knowledge now. You know what I mean?
yeah.
They may not have had as much knowledge back then, but just knowing the absolute destruction that occurred because of it was really, really upsetting to read about.
Yeah. And that I do think you're right. Obviously the scientific knowledge at the time was way more antiquated. I mean, they were looking at the brain like, a series of wires and something's not wired right, so we just need to snip some wires. When it's, obviously a lot more complex than that. It's a lot of chemical reactions involved and neurotransmitters. So,
Mm-hmm.
but what was interesting about the whole lobotomy case is that at one point it became less. I think initially Dr. Freeman really wanted to help people who were in institutions
Yeah.
who had no options, like that
Right.
this was a last resort. But I think at a certain point he got addicted to the notoriety and the fame that came along with this, and they
Absolutely.
even described in the book him doing double-fisted lobotomies, so he would do two at the same time, and it,
Mm.
it was essentially a circus act. I mean, they would do this out in public with an
Yeah.
audience and
No gloves.
no
No like
gloves,
sanitation or
no
anything.
anesthesia, no anesthesia. They would be awake for this procedure. And, basically they're just jabbing around blindly,
Yeah.
with the orbital lobotomy. They're just stabbing around in there, which was just horrific to even think about. Now, I was curious, Jane, so I did look up one thing after we read this book
Ooh.
because I had an inkling, which I'm sure you had the same inkling, but I figured that most of the lobotomies that were performed during this time were performed on women. I just knew it.
Yes.
Knew
I
it.
have an inkling too. Yes.
And by 1942, 75% of lobotomies by Dr. Freeman and Dr. Watts and other doctors that were mentioned were on women. Now, keep in mind that this is even though most institutionalized patients at the time were men.
Mm.
You know, that to me just really, you know, it speaks to something darker for sure. It definitely speaks to
Does.
something darker. And I think that, you know, when you look at the effects of the lobotomy, where a lot of people are, you know, very docile and
Yeah.
compliant afterwards, you know,
They don't really have
that's
thoughts for themselves or
right,
free will in some cases. They don't have free will sometimes.
right. And that's kind of what you wanted women to be like in
At the
that
time.
era.
At the time.
So, and when I looked up the statistics, and these were some statistics from, um, it wasn't the CDC, but it's like a National Health Institute. Um, there was a quote from a husband that said his wife was more normal than she'd ever been after having the lobotomy, even though she reported being less, you know, energetic, more lethargic. She lost kind of zest for life. She lost kind of a spark for life. So that was just kind of chilling to read.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, definitely some dark implications there, and I think that ties into one question I had, which is about the Rosemary Kennedy case.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one case that they did talk about in the book, her lobotomy. And do you think, I mean, do you think there's a particular reason why this author chose this section as the inspiration for the title?
That's a good question, Carrie. And yes, I do. I think it was looking back now. Well, for back then, it was kind of like I said, you have a common cold, get a lobotomy type of thing, and it was so like generally accepted. But now we know that it was like one of the most brutal things you could probably do to somebody. And also considering that, you know, he did mention that Rosemary Kennedy had this done to her. I'm not surprised that he put this as the title because that is probably one of the biggest medical historical things that we know of today. You know what I mean? So, you know, you really can't compete with a Kennedy for historical notoriety. So yeah,
Absolutely.
I exactly. So yes, I do think so, and I do think maybe a lot of people would have they could make the connection about it, you know, the Icepick surgeon, and you know,
Right.
you're not going to know about like Cleopatra, you know what I mean? Like I would if
Right.
it was about like Cleopatra and her experiments or something, like I don't know, the brutal queen or something, I don't know, it wouldn't capture my attention. But the Icepick surgeon, you automatically know it's like lobotomies, and you know who had them done and what was going on. So yeah, I think it's another really great hook. What do you think, Carrie?
I think so too. I definitely think that, you know, that story really illustrates the fact that no one was immune
Yes.
to some of these, you know, torturous sort of medical pursuits. You know, the fact that Rosemary Kennedy is from a very prominent family, and the fact that this was done, you know, against her wishes and against her
Mm-hmm.
mother's wishes as
Yeah.
well. Her father did this behind her mother's back. And, you know, I think that just speaks to some of those problems that we talked about earlier. Just some of the you know, gender
Yeah.
issues with medical ethics.
Yeah.
Um,
Something that I noticed too is that a lot of these stories, they focus on populations that didn't have an advocate for them back in the
right.
time. And of course, we know that like at the time, I think it was the 1950s that this was happening, 40s, 50s, I can't
Yes.
recall.
Mm-hmm.
You know, women were not, they didn't have as many, you know, options and things like that. They were, you know, treated a certain way. But we did see that throughout a lot of other stories too, where different populations were kind of used as these experiments because they didn't have anybody to advocate for them and their rights. So I think that just illustrated itself very well in the in the lobotomy section. But I did notice that was a
Right.
theme throughout the story, throughout all the stories.
For sure. And that was really one of the most disturbing parts to me, was with several of the stories. There were, government experiments like the Tuskegee experiments, and there were other experiments related to venereal diseases that the government did in foreign countries like Guatemala. And what really struck me is that these were perpetrated under the guise of helping these
Yeah.
underserved, very vulnerable populations, because in some of these areas, they were conducting the experiments on psychiatric patients, on soldiers, on prisoners.
Yeah.
There were even some children involved in some
Yeah.
of these experiments. And, the author doesn't really talk a lot about the Nazi experiments in this book. And I think that's just because, I would say most people are pretty well aware of those experiments. But, with the Nazi experiments, the, concentration camp victims, they know that they will be, at the very least, tortured and probably killed as a result of these experiments. But with the government experiments that this author discusses, the subjects think they're being helped.
Yeah.
They think they're being given treatment. And I think that is just the saddest part and the most unethical part of this whole ordeal.
I definitely
was
agree
just
with
rough.
that. Yeah, I agree with that, because it's one thing. Yeah, yeah, it's one thing to think you're being helped, but then to not have your consent into what's going on it's heartbreaking, and I saw that many times in this book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there were a couple of quotes in this book that kind of jumped out at me. And I just want to say it and get your reaction to it.
Yeah.
So the first one I wrote down was, "But when we sacrifice morals for scientific progress, we often end up with neither."
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I definitely agree with that. What do you think, Carrie?
Yeah. I think one of the things that this book really brings to the forefront is that people, even if they start out with good intentions, their ego can get in the way and they can become fanatical. And I think this is true in lots of different areas. So, it could be science, it could be social justice, it could be religion. I think, whenever you add fanaticism to the mix, I think people are willing to do evil things, and then they will, justify it to themselves or to others, because in the end, of course, they hope that they get a good end result. So, that kind of end justifies the means.
I was going to say that.
Sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I think that is definitely a slippery slope, and I think we saw that illustrated in this book several times, where people, started out with really good intentions, and then there were one or two things that happened, and then it just kind of got out of control.
Like there, especially with the lobotomies, and not to go back to lobotomies, but that was an interesting section in my mind. There was, I think towards the end of that section, they said that more like talking therapy was helping patients a lot more in psychiatric ones. And there was like a new wave of, we don't have to physically change the brain. We could chemically with medicine and, like discussion therapy and other like less invasive issues. And I think, or excuse me, methods. And I think if I read correctly, the doctor who had championed the lobotomy was like, no, this is the way to do it. This is the way to do it. And he didn't keep up with the times, and he didn't, see that we were progressing beyond this very barbaric treatment. And he just kept on doing it, and he kept on going right up until everyone was like, nah, this isn't it. And at that point, he had lost all like scientific motivation there because it wasn't because the science had already moved past that. You know what I mean? If it was doing it in the name of science, you know, he would want the next discovery to be less harmful. And, you know, you want to go where the science is going, basically. But
Right.
since he was kind of mired into this, well, I've championed this. And, you know, it became about his ego rather than keeping up with the scientific methods that were progressing forward. And I think that quote really was illustrated in this particular section. And yeah, it really, really stuck out to me there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that also kind of goes with the quote. He also quoted Carl Jung, and he said, "An evil person lurks inside all of us, and only if we recognize that fact can we hope to tame them." So yeah, that was kind of
Yeah.
shocking.
Yeah.
And I would probably agree that some people are wired differently. Like, you know, parts of their brain may not have developed as much, you know, maybe a part of the brain that deals with empathy and, you know, those sorts of attributes is not as developed, because I think certain people have a higher proclivity for evil, for sure. So one part of the book that we both kind of picked up on with the body snatchers was the kind of social implications, because when you talked about body snatching, the group of people who would most likely benefit from the science that would come out of that were poor people, who were more prone to get diseases and that sort of thing because of, you know, their living conditions.
And they couldn't afford medicine, or
and they couldn't afford they couldn't afford treatment. So they would likely benefit from, you know, medical progress related to, you know, doing dissections. So some politicians of the era justified the fact that their bodies were the ones being stolen, with that fact. Basically, it's the least they could do, and I think that was actually the quote. Like,
it's exactly it. Yeah,
this is the least that the poor population can do, is provide us with bodies for dissection.
Who approved that speech? That was a horrible speech.
Yeah. So how big of a part do you think in all of the cases that were talked about in this book, how big of a part did social class play?
Oh, I think it was at the heart of everything. I mean, going back to like the Cleopatra story, you know, these were maids that she was experiencing on. So they weren't like as I don't know too much about Egyptian hierarchy here, but I'm presuming that a maid was not as high class as like Cleopatra was. You know what I mean? So she's obviously working on people, and I think they were maids that had been sentenced to death anyway because of crimes, which that's a whole nother thing. You know, I don't know if it's made up or not, but how many of your maids are being sentenced to death? What's going on over in your palace, Cleopatra?
Yeah.
But getting back to the point, so obviously just from the beginning, we see that this like social class that's not as high as Cleopatra was being used in science. You know what I mean? And that's something we saw repeatedly through every single story. We saw it in the lobotomies, obviously, you know, with the psychiatric patients that unfortunately were, you know, of the lower class in their society. We saw it in many of the medical experiments that you were mentioning that they were government sanctioned. And it's incredibly unfortunate. And it goes right back to what I was saying, that they didn't have an advocate for them because they had, you know, they were perceived as a lower socioeconomic class and a lower class in every instance. What did you think, Carrie?
Yeah. That was really, you know, not shocking to me. I mean, just being a student of history, you kind of come to expect these things. But, you know, I did appreciate there were a couple instances, like with the body snatching, there was a rival politician who countered that he supported dissection. for people who were living off of the government, teat, so to speak, and that he proposed starting with the royal family.
Yeah, I
So
remember
I
that. That was interesting.
so it was kind of nice to hear a couple of kind of voices that were, speaking out against that sort of thing. But yeah, it
Yeah.
was unfortunate, and one of those things that you kind of expected
Yeah.
in that era. But I think that it really it kind of shows us that we should take a look at current medical
Mm.
practices and current biases and perspectives, because I think medicine is, it's a human invention, it's a human endeavor, so
Yeah.
you can't really separate the human bias
Yeah.
and faults from that.
Hmm.
So I think that it really kind of opened my eyes, and I had heard some things like women sometimes are more likely to be sent home if they have like heart attack symptoms and that sort of thing. And I think that you really need to be careful of even current biases
Yes.
related to
Yes.
medicine. If you think, well, she's just emotional, or she's just a little too anxious or hysterical, when it really could be a very physical,
Right.
life-threatening
Yeah.
issue. So
Yeah.
I don't know statistics on those sorts of things, but I would be interested to know, you know, what sort of bias is still going on in medicine.
Absolutely. But I think he did a good job of illustrating that. Even if it was very subtle in a lot of his stories, it was present almost in every single one of his stories. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
It was even in the beginning sections. He talked about a lot of naturalists and like the pirates and stuff, and
Man, the pirates.
yeah, he incorporated. It wasn't as overt in those sections because he incorporated the slave trade into that. So it wasn't necessarily that slaves were being used as for experiments, but it was that you know pirates and naturalists were using the slave ports, and conducting business with
Mhm.
slavers and that sort of thing. So it wasn't as overt, but it still dealt with definitely a you know at risk population. Um, Now the end of the book was very ominous
Yeah.
because it talked about the potential harm of things like artificial intelligence and tech hacking and that sort of thing. So, what were your thoughts on that?
I loved it. I thought that was a brilliant way to end the book because he had spent all this time talking about like history and kind of like setting up like the lessons already and then trying to apply them to potential future issues. I thought that was really brilliant. I would never have expected it to end like that, and I thought it was very well done. Um, the part that I thought was really interesting was that crimes in space, like who has the authority? Do you remember that? Where he was like, who
Yeah,
has authority to like prosecute, crimes, especially medical crimes in space? And that was something like I had never thought of before, and especially considering like where we're going now, and today, and all this, weird and wonderful stuff. That's something to think about now. And I would never have thought in my lifetime that I would have to ask myself the question of what happens if there's a crime in space? So, what do you think, Carrie?
yeah, that was pretty neat how he did that at the end of the book. I really liked that because I think sometimes nonfiction books can kind of, they wrap everything up and the ending's kind of flat. I
Mhm.
mean, it's just kind of a summary. It's just kind of a wrap up. But with this, he really made you think a little bit about, future problems and how everything he talked about is related, and how, I had a flashback to watching an episode of Homeland where I can't remember if it was the president or the vice president, but one of the characters in Homeland had a pacemaker, and a terrorist group actually hacked into his pacemaker. They were able to get the serial number and they were able to hack into it. And that's something I never really thought about. But
Yeah.
and this was several years ago, because that show's been off the air for a while. So it really makes you think, like, is this a possibility? Is this something that's happening now that we don't actually know about? So pretty scary there.
Yeah. It's terrifying. And something you never thought you'd have to think about. You know what I mean? But we do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we do.
The self-driving cars, he brought up the point of, um, what if a self-driving car locked the doors and then just sped off a cliff?
Yep.
So I was just like, okay, I'm
I was like,
never
well,
getting in a
I'm
self-driving
never
car.
sleeping again. Thank you, Sam Keen.
Yeah, that was pretty whew. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was pretty intense.
But he has a point, though. That's the thing. And I liked how he had set up all these, like, well, historically, we didn't have ethics, in science. So what makes you think in the future we will? And that, I think, was probably the scariest part of this book, because he
Yeah,
had set up his argument so well through every single one
right.
of the stories that you have to just sit there and you'll be like, yeah, what do we do about these self-driving cars? And nobody's thought
Right.
about that before, but I thought it was pretty brilliant.
It is super scary because, the technology has just far outrun our legal system and,
Hmm.
codes of ethics and those sorts of things. So I just feel like this will always be a problem from
Yeah.
here on out. I just feel like the technology is just growing exponentially, and we just have such a hard time. It takes so long, I think, for society to really catch up
Yeah.
to the technology.
And by the time they
Um,
do, it's gone anyway. So
yeah,
we're
so
always playing catch up.
I don't know if I feel any better. Like, do I want my health and my safety to be in the hands of a doctor, a human who could be unethical, or do I want it in the hands of
A
some sort of
self-driving car that could
technology?
run out the cliff. Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know. They're both quite terrifying at this
they
point
are,
after
aren't
reading this
they?
book.
It
Oh
is.
no.
But it was
So,
interesting. I liked the way he ended it. I have to say, I liked it. I liked the way he did that.
yes. So, is there anything else, Jane, that you wanted to talk about from the book or mention
Um,
or
I think I was kind of surprised on the very last one about the fraud. Do you remember that one? It was about the Superwoman testing, the drug testing.
I
No.
don't remember that.
Okay. Well, so
What drug was it?
it was all the drugs. So it was about this woman who, I forget her name, Annie Dukin, I think.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. She
Where she
worked in
was
the
like
lab.
in the
Yeah.
lab and she was testing drugs, and for the police. And she was, having these wonderful numbers and she was super productive and they were catching up like from decades of their work. And then it turns out that she was faking it like a
Yeah.
lot. And
Yeah.
I'm like, how the heck do you get to that point where you are literally in charge of whether people go to jail, if they spend life in prison or not,
Yeah.
and you just look at a drug and be like, I think this is X, Y, and Z, and that's what you base it off of? That part scared the crap out of me because it was just, yeah, that was scary.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big implication for our justice system. And I
Mm,
forget how many the stats they rolled off with that story, how many people had to be
so many.
released, their cases were overturned, some cases had to be re-prosecuted. And so this one person, just because she, was so unethical,
Yeah,
all of these other people have to start from scratch.
right.
Um, Cape Codder, he asked if they got into
Hey.
animal testing, and
Oh,
they
you're
did.
one of your favorites.
They didn't get into animal testing per se, but they did get into animal torture related to the Tesla Edison feud.
Hmm.
And I thought there was a very interesting quote from some of Thomas Edison's contemporaries at the time. They said that Edison had a vacuum where his conscience ought to be.
Yeah.
And I think he's another person, so brilliant, so intelligent, but very much, got tunnel vision and,
Ends justify the means.
wanted to defeat, Tesla's alternating current no matter the cost.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of innocent animals were electrocuted as a result. And what I found really interesting about that is that Edison was able to just completely abandon his own personal moral code
Oh yeah.
related to the death penalty in order to make alternating current look bad. So he was against the death penalty. But when some people approached him and said, look, we're looking for a more kind of foolproof way to conduct executions, and we think that electricity might actually work, he, of course, kind of sneakily suggested that they use alternating current. And so that I found really interesting, because it was just like he would forego anything he believed in for his belief in science, I guess. Well, really not even science. I mean, it was really about his ego at that point.
It was. I actually had not known. I did not know that much about the Edison versus Tesla feud. That was a really interesting chapter for me, because I didn't know that there had been that dynamic of Edison, having this abandonment of his ethics versus Tesla being like, kind of just chill out and be like, yeah, I know my stuff, So that was kind of interesting for me to read, because I hadn't known about that. I know you knew a little bit more about it, but I thought that was a very, very interesting chapter.
Yeah, I was always impressed with Tesla, because I felt like he was someone who really would forego all of those things that most people sought out, the notoriety, the fame, the money. For him, it was about the science, in a more positive way, to his own detriment personally, because of course he was taken advantage of, and Westinghouse kind of got one over on him, and
that was horrible.
So
that was awful.
Unfortunately it doesn't work out for him personally, but I definitely have more respect for him than I do for Edison. And I did learn a fun fact about Tesla that I didn't know.
Oh, what was it, Carrie?
Scared of peaches.
Oh, yes.
And pearls. Very,
don't know about that.
Very interesting. Everyone has their own little quirks,
They do.
I'm scared of birds. Tesla's scared of peaches. We all have our things.
And girls.
So.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. I was like, it's an odd thing.
Yeah. Ryan brought up Theranos.
Yes. I was actually surprised that wasn't in this book, but I think, is it still ongoing though? I think it's still ongoing.
I think that trial.
So maybe that's why he didn't want to
right now.
Yeah. He didn't want to write about it. But yeah, I thought about that too, but it was very similar to that. But it was about somebody in the lab testing drugs that the police had confiscated, and then saying what the drugs were without really testing them, or testing them to the bare minimum and not really being certain. So she was going through all these massive quantities of drugs and wrongfully saying, yep, he had cocaine, when in fact it was baby powder or something like that, So yeah, that was hard. But I would have loved to see a Theranos. I don't know how you say it.
Yeah, I think it's Theranos.
I would have loved to see a Theranos chapter on this, because I studied that in a class that I was taking a while ago, and it is one of the most interesting cases in my mind, how somebody pulls that off. It's like the Enron of the medical field. It's really actually quite brilliant. But no, that's my one disappointment, that they didn't have a chapter on that. But I think you kind of had to pick one or the other. You'd either have to pick Theranos or the Superwoman, the Dorkin, is that what her name? Dorkin? I don't know.
Yeah, Dukan or Dukan.
Yeah. You'd probably have to pick one or the other, because they are very, very similar in tone. But yeah, I wish that that's one thing I would have liked to read more about.
Yeah, and I think that whole episode is very interesting because of the image that she projected and how she really was able to gain people's confidence.
Oh, yeah.
I think that you really have to look at that as well, how you perceive people. She had the black turtleneck, she had the Steve Jobs, kind of persona going on. She had the deep voice, there were all these things that she really manufactured about herself to get people to trust her. And unfortunately, doctors kind of have a lot of that automatically, right? We kind of give them that trust just because they have that title, and we presume they're there to help us. So we see it as a sacred trust. But based on the books we've been reading lately, Jane,
Yeah. We don't trust any doctors. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm
I'm
kidding.
telling you, it's very, very interesting. Um, Ryan said her deep, creepy voice. Yes,
Yeah.
Ryan, I kind of found it a very creepy, and I always got the vibe that it was manufactured, and I think that's one of the reasons it was so creepy to me. Um, so yeah, very, very interesting there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Yeah. Oh, thank you. The more discussions need to happen with this on BookTube.
That was very
These
nice.
are the
Thank you,
discussions we
Ryan.
need more on
Yeah.
BookTube. That was nice. Thank you. Well, we will be having more discussions. We're very excited about. I don't know if we want to talk about them later or
Well, we
not,
can
but
talk about it now. We
we
haven't
can.
hit an hour, so we can give them a little preview.
All right. You want to take it away, Carrie?
So next month, Jane and I, is it next month?
It is.
It
It's
is
in
next. Okay.
March. Yeah.
Yeah, next month we are going to be reading two books. We're going to start out reading Lolita by Nabokov, and right after that, we are going to read The Real Lolita, which is the true story. I think it's an 11-year-old who was kidnapped by someone claiming to be an FBI agent, and so we're going to delve into those two, and we thought it would be a really interesting comparison because we both also read My Dark Vanessa. That's not one of the books that we buddy read together. I know it seems like we read everything
I
together,
know.
but we did not read that one together. But
Shocking.
we did think that would make for a very interesting discussion.
Mhm.
And of course, I love the nonfiction angle. So anytime we can work nonfiction into it, I think that's always a valuable discussion to have. So I'm really excited for that, and I hope that some people will show up for that. And then, did we have anything else on tap after that, Jane? I can't remember.
We have some that we're thinking about, but we have to get through Lolita first and see how that
Yes.
goes. Yes. So
Yes.
we possibly will. Carrie and I always have a great time whenever we do our book discussions together. We've done this is what, our third, I think. We
Yes.
did
Mhm.
what was the first one we did?
Um,
Not Dr. Cream. Dr. Cream was the
it was
second
with
one.
Mary Deerfield.
Oh, Hour of the Witch.
Hour of the Witch.
Yep, the Hour of the Witch. That was our first fiction buddy read together, and our first buddy read. Then we read The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream, and then now we read The Icepick, and then we're going to be reading the Lolita, and we're probably going to just keep going, to be honest, until somebody doesn't watch anymore. And even then, we probably still do this, but it's a good time. It's always a good time whenever Jane and Carrie team up.
Well, Kate Cotter said that we should do a monthly live show. So
That's a good idea. That's a good idea, like a little Jane and Carrie book club.
Yeah, well, we are pretty much doing that right now. I
Yeah.
think the last 2 months we have, and probably next month we'll have the
Probably.
Lolita. So we'll see if we can keep that going. Ryan, I like what you're doing. You're reading, you just read Moby Dick, and you're about to read the nonfiction account, The Heart of the Sea. So that's really interesting.
Hey.
My husband has read Moby Dick, and I just it's such a behemoth book, and I know that it's just chock full of whaling terms. So I haven't really made the decision to dive into that one yet, but maybe one day. Maybe
I see
one
what you
day.
did there, Carrie.
A little
Dive
pun there
in.
for you.
I like it.
I can't help it. I'm so cheesy. My students know. Nice. Okay. Well, it sounds like it's worth it.
Yeah.
Well, all right, Jane. I think that just about covers it. That kind of covers everything I had to discuss. I had so much fun reading this with you, and I cannot wait for our next month reads. So excited for that. So
I'm
thank
so
you.
excited for our Lolita-thon. I'm just thrilled. Ever since when did I talk to you about it? Like in January or something?
Yes.
Like first thing in January?
Yes.
And then you were like, Jane, we have to get through Dr. Cream. Then we have to get through the Icepick Surgeon. Like, sit down. And I'm like, okay. But then, so I'm excited. We've had this booked for months at a time, but I'm excited for it. I'm thrilled.
Jane knows I have a whiteboard at my house with
it's really impressive.
Each month I have what buddy read I'm doing, and then I have possibles written over to the side. So Yeah,
And
I'm
Lady
really
Jane's like
excited.
in all of them, and I felt really bad.
Yeah, no, it's all good. And now it's funny because I just mailed Tom a book after last week's live show. I mailed him a book that I had a duplicate of. So I think we're gonna do another one too. So I think this
Nice.
year I'm just gonna buddy read everything
Yes,
with,
I love it.
you and Tom.
There we go. There's nothing wrong with that. We love it. I am good with that plan.
Yeah, so it should be a lot of fun. But I want to thank everybody who showed up for this live show. Had so much fun, and hopefully we'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.
Absolutely. Bye, guys. Thank you so much.